When we experience discomfort, the natural instinct is to pull back. That's because the human nervous system is designed to detect deviations from safety and respond with resistance. But here's the key point. Discomfort is not a signal to stop. It's a signal that your brain and body are beginning the process of adaptation. Let's look at this through the lens of neurobiology. The brain operates using prediction and efficiency. It maps the world based on what is familiar and then attempts to automate as much as possible to conserve energy. This is why habits, both good and bad, are powerful. They become embedded in neural circuits, especially in areas like the basal ganglia, which specialize in routine behavior. When you introduce a new behavior, something unfamiliar, something hard, the system detects an error signal. That signal is discomfort. It's your brain flagging a prediction error. But instead of interpreting it as a problem, you need to reframe it as a message. Change is happening. During the initial stages of any effort, whether physical training, cognitive work, or emotional self-regulation, you are literally destabilizing established circuits. You are demanding energy and attention to build new connections. This process is metabolically expensive, meaning it requires effort, glucose, oxygen, and attention. Your body will resist because its baseline programming favors efficiency. But pushing through this phase is where plasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire, actually turns on. What's even more fascinating is that certain neuromodulators, specifically norepinephrine and acetylcholine, are released during discomfort and high attentional states. These chemicals flag the circuits being used and tag them for change. The more you engage during discomfort, the stronger the signal. You're teaching your brain this matters. That tagging leads to rewiring, especially when followed by sleep and recovery, which consolidate the changes. Now let's make this practical. Suppose you sit down to learn a new skill, maybe coding or a language or public speaking, and you feel resistance after 10 minutes. Your attention starts to wander, your body gets restless. That is the moment most people stop. But that exact moment is also the threshold of change. If you can stay engaged for just a bit longer, 15, 20 more minutes, you drive the system into adaptation mode. You build capacity. You train the brain to tolerate friction. And that's how your threshold for discomfort expands. This is not about masochism. It's about leveraging biology. Discomfort is the entry fee to leveling up. It's the signal that your nervous system is breaking old patterns and creating new ones. The worst thing you can do is misread that signal and retreat. Instead, learn to lean into it. Stay just beyond the edge of comfort. Not in panic, but in focused challenge. That's where the shift happens. So when you feel the friction, when your mind says this is hard, let's stop, recognize it for what it is. That's not failure. That's not weakness. That is the sound of your brain learning. And learning, by definition, is uncomfortable. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, is not something reserved for the young or the gifted. It's not a passive process that unfolds over time like erosion or aging. It's an active, highly specific biological mechanism that responds to particular conditions. The key ingredients that drive plasticity are urgency, focus, repetition, and rest. If you don't engage all four, you're leaving most of your brain's potential for change on the table. Let's start with urgency. Your brain is constantly scanning for what matters. It doesn't bother to rewire itself for things it deems unimportant or non-threatening. When something feels urgent, whether that urgency is emotional, physical, or even imagined, it triggers the release of specific neuromodulators like norepinephrine and dopamine. These chemicals heighten alertness and mark neural circuits for change. In other words, Urgency is what tells the brain this experience needs to be remembered, encoded, and adapted to. Without urgency, you might still be doing something difficult, but the biological machinery for change won't engage deeply. Now layer in focus. Focus is the spotlight of consciousness when you direct sustained attention to a task, especially one that challenges you. Your brain increases activity in the prefrontal cortex and associated networks. This focus is like aiming a laser at specific neural pathways. The more precisely you focus, the more accurately the brain can tag which circuits to reinforce. Distraction scatters that effect. Multitasking in the context of plasticity is essentially wasted effort. Focused effort is where deep change happens. Then comes repetition. Neural change is not a one and done event. Synapses, the connections between neurons, are reinforced through repeated activation. This is often referred to as Hebbian learning. Neurons that fire together wire together. The more often a pathway is used under conditions of urgency and focus, the stronger and more efficient it becomes. Repetition creates efficiency. It builds fluency. It's how deliberate practice turns into automaticity. But there's a fourth, often overlooked ingredient: rest. And not just passive downtime. True recovery, deep sleep, especially slow wave sleep, is when the brain consolidates learning. During sleep, the neural circuits activated during practice are reactivated and strengthened. In some cases, performance improves overnight without additional practice, simply because the brain has had time to reinforce what it encoded earlier without sufficient rest. Even focused, urgent, repeated practice can fail to translate into lasting change. So age, while it does influence the ease of neuroplasticity, is not a gatekeeper. Adults absolutely retain the capacity to rewire their brains. What they need to do is create the internal conditions that allow it. That means cultivating urgency through challenge or purpose, maintaining deep focus, committing to structured repetition, and protecting recovery periods. If you want to level up in any domain, whether it's physical skill, mental discipline, emotional regulation, or creativity, you don't just need time. You need to signal to your brain that the change is essential. Do that consistently, and the system responds. Not because of age, but because the biology of plasticity is being properly activated. There's a specific window when you feel the most resistance to taking action, where the nervous system is actually primed for the deepest transformation. Most people misinterpret this window as a stop sign. In reality, it's a green light. Forcing action during these moments, when everything in your body and mind wants to pull back, is what initiates long-term behavioral shifts at the neural level. Here's why. Resistance isn't just psychological, it's physiological. Your brain and body have built-in systems to conserve energy and avoid risk. These systems are coordinated through the autonomic nervous system, particularly the parasympathetic branch, which promotes rest and homeostasis. When you contemplate a difficult task, waking up early, going to the gym, having a hard conversation, that system senses a deviation from safety and ramps up friction. You might feel fatigue, anxiety, or distraction. That's not weakness. That's the system protecting its existing wiring. But when you override that resistance with action, especially consistent, repeated action, you begin to shift the baseline. That override tells your nervous system, this behavior is no longer optional. It's part of who we are now. This is critical. The brain is a prediction machine. It constantly maps your identity based on what you do, not what you intend. Every time you force yourself to act when you don't feel like it, you weaken the old circuits that kept you stuck and strengthen the ones that represent the new behavior. Now let's get specific. In those moments of resistance, something powerful happens chemically. The release of norepinephrine, a neurochemical associated with alertness and arousal, spikes. If you act while norepinephrine is elevated, it creates what's called a teaching signal in the brain. That signal flags the behavior as important, as something worth remembering. The more times you act through that friction, the more efficient that neural pathway becomes. Eventually, the resistance lowers, not because it disappeared, but because the system adapted to meet the new demand. This is why behavioral change is not about motivation. Motivation is transient and unreliable. It rises and falls based on sleep, blood sugar, emotion, and a dozen other variables. What is reliable is the plasticity that results from repeated, effortful action during high resistance states. That's where the real rewiring occurs. It's also important to understand that this process requires precision. Mindless repetition won't get you far. It has to be intentional, focused action in the presence of discomfort. That's what creates the conditions for deep learning and habit formation. And the more often you train yourself to act when it's hard, the more you condition your brain to expect forward motion even when friction arises. In essence, the path to durable change isn't paved with ease. It's forged through resistance. Force yourself through it, not recklessly, but deliberately. And you trigger the very biology that reshapes who you are. Most people misunderstand dopamine. They think of it as the molecule of pleasure, something released when you experience a reward. But that's only part of the picture. Dopamine isn't primarily about the reward itself. It's about the pursuit of the reward. It's the neurochemical that gives you energy, drive, and motivation to go after difficult goals, even before you achieve anything. From a biological standpoint, dopamine is tightly linked to our ability to anticipate outcomes. It's what enables the brain to project forward in time and assign value to future rewards. When dopamine levels rise, especially in the context of a challenging task, they increase your willingness to exert effort. This system evolved to keep us moving, to push us toward things that require work, hunting, learning, building, training. Not to make us feel good for no reason. When you pursue something meaningful, something just out of reach, the brain begins to release dopamine in anticipation of the outcome. That's critical. It's not just what you achieve that shapes your brain, it's how hard you pursue it. The amount of dopamine you self-generate during effort will, over time, dictate how resilient you are, how focused you stay, and whether you begin to associate hard things with internal reward. This is where things get interesting. When you learn to enjoy the effort, to self-reward during the challenge, you engage a powerful feedback loop. Each time you overcome resistance, stay focused, and keep going despite setbacks, you teach your brain that the process itself is valuable. That's not philosophical, that's chemical. Dopamine becomes your internal fuel, not just a reaction to success. Now compare that with external rewards, likes, attention, money, praise. These can spike dopamine too, but they come after the task and often make future effort feel less meaningful unless that external hit follows again. That's how dependency on external motivation forms. Over time, it trains the brain to only release dopamine when a guaranteed reward is present. That's a fragile system. To build sustainable drive, you have to reverse that dependency. You need to train your system to release dopamine during effort. That means embracing challenge not as a burden, but as a signal. This is the moment where I'm building capacity. You literally become more capable, not just mentally, but biologically. Every time you self-generate motivation through internal effort, and the beauty of this system is that it compounds. The more you tap into dopamine during difficult tasks, the more efficient the system becomes. You start associating hard work with meaning, discomfort with progress, and resistance with opportunity. That's the chemistry of leveling up. So the next time you feel the pull to quit, remind yourself, dopamine isn't waiting at the finish line. It's available now if you lean into the pursuit. If you learn to enjoy that, even briefly, you change your brain's relationship to effort, and that changes everything. Resilience isn't just a mindset, it's a physiological capacity. Your ability to handle stress, persist through discomfort, and stay mentally clear under pressure depends heavily on how well you can regulate your nervous system. The good news is that this capacity isn't fixed. It can be trained, and some of the most powerful tools for building resilience are not psychological, they're biological. Specifically, cold exposure, focused vision, and breath control. Let's start with cold exposure. When you deliberately place your body in an uncomfortable but controlled cold environment like a cold shower, ice bath, or even unheated outdoor conditions, you activate the sympathetic nervous system. Heart rate increases, norepinephrine spikes, and the body enters a state of alert. But what makes this powerful is what you do in that state. If you can stay calm, control your breathing, slow your mind, you begin to rewire how your body responds to stress. You teach your system that you can experience high arousal without panic. Over time, this reduces your reactivity in real-world stressors, work pressure, emotional tension, even pain, because your threshold for discomfort has increased. Now let's look at focused vision. Most people overlook the role of the visual system in state regulation. When you're stressed or anxious, your field of vision naturally constricts. Tunnel vision kicks in. That's a hardwired survival response. But here's the catch. The visual system is a two-way street. You can use deliberate visual focus to change your internal state. When you narrow your vision intentionally, locking your gaze on a single point, you send a signal to the brain that it's time for action. This recruits neural circuits involved in goal-directed behavior. You become less reactive and more task-oriented. Focused vision drives focused mind, and it's trainable. Then there's breath control. This is perhaps the most direct lever you have over your autonomic nervous system. Your breath is a bridge between conscious and unconscious systems. When you inhale, you activate the sympathetic system. When you exhale slowly, especially with a long pause, you engage the parasympathetic system, your calming, restorative network. Techniques like physiological sighs, 2 quick inhales followed by a slow exhale, can shift you from a panicked state to a calm, focused one in under a minute. This isn't opinion. It's rooted in the biology of the diaphragm, carbon dioxide sensitivity, and vagus nerve stimulation. Now imagine what happens when you combine these tools. You enter cold, narrow your focus, and control your breath. You're training your brain and body under pressure, using ancient systems that evolved for survival. But instead of being reactive, you're becoming deliberate. You're building the capacity to stay present in discomfort. And the brain takes note. Every time you do this, you reinforce circuits that say, I can handle more. That's resilience. You don't need motivation to build this. You need consistency and awareness. Use these tools not just when you're stressed, but as training. Because resilience isn't something you hope for in hard moments. It's something you earn in advance by building control over your biology. There's a common myth that holds people back from real change, the idea that you need to feel ready before you act, that readiness is some internal state. Calm, confident, clear, arriving like a signal to move. But biology doesn't work that way. Readiness is not a prerequisite for action. It's a result of action. The nervous system builds readiness through behavior, not before it. Let's break this down neurologically. The brain is always mapping risk and energy expenditure. When you think about doing something hard, getting up earlier, starting a new routine, initiating a difficult conversation, your system does a cost-benefit analysis. And without previous reference points or success patterns, it leans toward inaction. That's not laziness, it's energy conservation. Your brain is protecting you from perceived threat. But here's the problem. If you wait for certainty or confidence before you move, you're reinforcing the exact circuits that keep you stuck. What changes the system is movement, even small, friction-filled action. The motor system of the brain is tightly linked to motivational circuitry, especially through areas like the basal ganglia and dopaminergic midbrain. When you take action, particularly in the face of doubt or resistance, you engage those circuits and begin to build internal momentum. You send a powerful message. This behavior matters. That message isn't philosophical. It's electrochemical. One of the most interesting things about dopamine, the neuromodulator that governs motivation, is that it's not just released when you reach a goal, it's released when you move toward a goal. Even micro exceptions like standing up, organizing your environment, or writing down a task can trigger dopamine, creating a sense of forward motion. That's how readiness is built, through action, not through thinking. Now, this doesn't mean reckless behavior. It means strategic initiation. You start before you feel ready. You use structure and tools to carry you through the early resistance. That might look like setting a timer, reducing the scope of the task, or simply focusing your vision on one point and breathing intentionally for 60 seconds. These are cues to the nervous system that it's safe to proceed, even without full clarity. Over time, the system adapts. What once felt impossible begins to feel normal, even automatic. This is the same principle used in exposure therapy, elite athletic training, and even military resilience protocols. You do the thing before you feel capable, and in doing so, you become capable. Because the brain doesn't upgrade your identity based on your thoughts, it upgrades based on your patterns. And patterns are built through repeated action, especially when they conflict with your internal resistance. So if you're waiting to feel motivated, stop. If you're waiting for confidence, stop. Those will follow. Not immediately, but inevitably if you act. Readiness lives on the other side of motion. And your nervous system learns who you are by watching what you do. Lasting change doesn't come from inspiration. It comes from override. The nervous system defaults to what is familiar, what has been repeated, rehearsed, and reinforced over time. That's your baseline. It doesn't care whether those patterns are serving you or destroying your potential. It only cares about efficiency. So if you want change that sticks, you need to interrupt the default and replace it with something better. Repeatedly, consistently, and with deliberate intensity. From a biological perspective, your baseline behaviors are embedded in deeply rooted neural circuits, primarily in the basal ganglia. These circuits are automatic. They don't require conscious thought. That's why old habits feel so effortless, even the ones that harm you. They've been encoded through repetition, and over time, they've become the brain's go-to pathways. Trying to change these patterns with motivation or good intentions alone doesn't work. Those are transient. What's required is force, meaning intentional, effortful action that contradicts the current default. Force in this context doesn't mean aggression or chaos. It means controlled, directed effort applied consistently over time. Think of it like lifting a heavy weight. The first reps are awkward and unstable, but as you keep going, the nervous system recruits more efficient motor patterns and the load begins to feel manageable. Behavioral change works the same way. At first, the override feels clunky. You'll resist it. Your body and mind will try to pull you back to baseline. But with enough reps, enough consistent overrides, the new pattern becomes the preferred one. What makes this process stick is deliberate execution. Random effort doesn't rewire circuits. The brain needs specificity. When you act in a way that directly counters your old pattern, and you do it with focus, you engage the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for conscious decision making. That region helps suppress the automatic behaviors and enforce the new ones. The more often you activate it in the context of change, the more influence it exerts over time. You're literally shifting control from unconscious automation to conscious direction. And none of this happens without consistency. One-time efforts don't create new wiring, neural change. Plasticity is driven by repeated activation of the same circuits under meaningful conditions. That means you can't wait for the perfect mood, the right circumstances, or a sense of readiness. You show up, apply the override, and do it again tomorrow. Each repetition weakens the old loop and strengthens the new one. Each decision to act in alignment with your goal, not your feelings, reshapes the brain's internal architecture. So when we talk about real transformation, deep, lasting change, it doesn't come from hoping or visualizing or waiting for inspiration. It comes from identifying the behavior you want, facing the internal resistance head on, and applying deliberate pressure against your own defaults again and again. You don't wait for the system to shift, you force it. And with enough consistent override, your baseline itself begins to move. That's when the change stops being effortful and starts becoming who you are. Change doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for the perfect mood, the ideal conditions, or a wave of motivation. It responds to pressure, intentional, repeated, uncomfortable pressure. The brain, through its biology, is built to adapt, but only when it's shown again and again that adaptation is necessary. That's your job, to create that signal, to push through resistance, act before you're ready, and override what's automatic with what's deliberate. You have tools: breath, focus, movement, cold, effort. You have systems: dopamine, neuroplasticity, autonomic control, that are designed to help you evolve. But none of them activate until you take the first step, especially when it's hard. The discomfort is not the barrier, it's the entry point. Force yourself forward in those moments, and the biology will catch up. This isn't about motivation. It's about learning to command your internal state using real mechanisms to shape your behavior. Every time you choose action over hesitation, you're not just building habits. You're building a new version of yourself, wired for resilience, for discipline, and for forward momentum. The signal is clear. Level up not when it's easy, but because it's hard. Your nervous system will meet you there, but only if you move first.